There is a quiet, humiliating moment that almost everyone has experienced, though very few will admit it out loud. You are sitting at a group dinner or in a crowded conference room. You lean in to make a perfectly valid point, and right in the middle of your sentence, someone cuts you off. They speak over you as if you aren't even there. Pay close attention to what your body does next. If you are like most people, you instinctively speed up your words. You raise the pitch of your voice. You try to force your way back into the center of the conversation by talking just a little bit faster, hoping they will let you finish. In that split second, you think you are defending your territory. But in the cold reality of human nature, you didn't defend anything. You just showed them your throat. This is the great, unspoken trap of modern social dynamics. We are conditioned to believe that if we just explain ourselves clearly enough, if we are just a little more articulate, or if we show just how much we care, we will eventually be given the respect we deserve. That is a lie. The harder you work to be seen, the more invisible you become. When you rush to fill dead air, when you over-emote to make sure the people around you are comfortable, or when you endlessly justify your decisions to those who haven't earned the right to question them, you are committing a critical psychological error. You are broadcasting what I call the bleeding signal. Overprojection is not a sign of confidence. It is a subconscious plea for permission to exist in the room. You're asking the group to validate your worth, and in doing so, you're handing them the authority to deny it. The Machiavellian players, the narcissists, and the quiet opportunists navigating your workplace or your social circle do not care about the content of your words. They are not listening to your brilliant argument. They are reading the desperation in your rhythm. They smell the effort, and in the ruthless game of power dynamics, the effort to be liked is the ultimate vulnerability. Once they realize you need their attention to feel secure, they will systematically withhold it just to watch you dance for it. You have to understand a fundamental law of human behavior. People do not value what is freely and anxiously given. If you throw your energy at people, they will step out of the way and let you fall. You cannot negotiate your way into a position of strength by being the loudest or the most accommodating person in the room. Do not demand respect. Engineer a reality where disrespect is simply too expensive. To achieve this, you have to completely dismantle the way you currently interact with the world. You must stop viewing conversations as a place to prove your worth and start viewing them as a landscape where you manage your exposure. The person who controls the room is never the one frantically trying to hold everyone's gaze. It is the person who seems entirely unaffected by whether they are being looked at or not. They do not compete for space. They allow the space to contour around them. Right now, your aura is leaking. You are giving away your psychological leverage in micro moments every single day, in the nervous laughter you use to soften a statement, in the way you immediately reply to a message that disrespects your time, and in the way you shift your posture when someone of higher status walks by. You are playing a game with rules designed to keep you at the bottom. To stop being a participant in their game, you first have to master the most terrifying tool in the Machiavellian arsenal: the architecture of the void. The architecture of the void begins the moment you stop actively participating in the frantic exchange of social energy. When you stop giving people the desperate, immediate reactions they expect, you introduce them to a weapon most people are entirely unequipped to handle: the tactical deployment of silence. Imagine you are sitting across from a manager who has just delivered an unfair, sharp critique of your work. Or perhaps you're on a date with someone who has just made a subtly degrading comment designed to test your boundaries. The standard, conditioned human reflex is immediate defense. Your heart rate spikes, and you want to correct the record, to explain exactly why they are wrong, or perhaps to laugh it off defensively to diffuse the sudden tension. Instead, you do absolutely nothing. You do not scowl. You do not force a polite smile. You do not shift your weight or break eye contact. You simply hold their gaze with a flat, unbared expression and let 3 full seconds of absolute silence stretch between you. 1. 2, 3. In those 3 seconds, the entire dynamic of the room fractures and rebuilds itself in your favor. Human nature is fundamentally terrified of a vacuum. We are socially wired from a young age to keep the gears of interaction turning smoothly, to nod, to agree, and to fill conversational gaps so that no one feels awkward. When you drop a void into the middle of a high-stakes conversation, you are abruptly refusing to do the emotional labor of keeping the other person comfortable. You force them to sit with the harsh, ringing echo of their own words. Because they cannot read your reaction, their internal anxiety spikes. They begin to project their own insecurities into that blank space. To relieve the agonizing tension of the void, they will almost always break first. They will backpedal, they will nervously over-explain their supposed joke, or they will immediately start negotiating against themselves. This is the mechanics of power in its purest, most distilled form. Power is not about having the sharpest comeback or the loudest voice. It is about who can endure social discomfort the longest. When you react immediately to a provocation, you're confirming that their words have an impact on your internal state. You're proving that they have successfully reached you, which grants them superiority. Silence, on the other hand, is an impenetrable psychological wall. It signals that their input was received, coldly evaluated, and found entirely unworthy of a response. It strips the aggressor of their momentum. They threw a punch, and instead of hitting flesh, they hit empty air, pulling themselves off balance. You must practice this physical stillness in your daily life until it becomes second nature. When someone asks you an invasive or condescending question, do not stammer through a polite excuse. Pause. Look at them calmly. Let the dead air hang in the room until they feel the inappropriate weight of what they just asked. When a client or colleague demands a ridiculous concession, do not immediately justify your position. Let the silence suffocate their demand. By controlling the pacing of the interaction, you establish yourself as the absolute authority in that space. You are no longer reacting to their erratic rhythm. They are being forced to adapt to yours. At first, wielding this kind of silence will feel entirely unnatural. Your instincts will scream at you to speak, to smooth things over, to return to the perceived safety of being compliant and agreeable. You must resist that urge. Let the silence burn. Watch closely as the people who previously took you for granted or tried to diminish you begin to stumble over their own words, suddenly eager to win back the comfort you just took away. You will realize how easily people can be manipulated by simply doing nothing at all. But silence is only a shield. Once you have thrown them off balance, you must master the art of the invisible knife. Total emotional unreachability. Silence is the shield that stops their immediate attack, but true invulnerability requires you to master the invisible knife. Total emotional unreachability. Picture a gathering where that one chronically toxic relative, or perhaps a passive-aggressive co-worker in the break room, drops a thinly veiled insult wrapped in a joke. They smile, eyes glinting, waiting for your reaction. They want the flush of red in your cheeks. They want you to snap back, to lose your temper, or worse, to force a strained, compliant laugh just to keep the peace. This time, you give them absolutely nothing. You do not scowl, you do not laugh. You look at them with a blank, analyzing stare, as if you are observing a bizarre, slightly pathetic specimen in a glass jar. You let their provocation hit the armor of your detachment and slide uselessly to the floor. This brings us to a cold, necessary reframe, and it is going to sting. If you find yourself constantly navigating disrespect, being continuously undermined, or feeling emotionally exhausted by the people around you, it is not simply bad luck. The world is not uniquely out to get you. The harsh reality is that you have trained them to treat you this way. You have been rewarding their bad behavior with the most valuable currency you possess, your emotional energy. You think your anger in these moments projects strength, but it actually signals that they have successfully breached your walls. You think over-explaining yourself shows maturity, but it only demonstrates submission. You are not just a passive target. You are an active participant who is broadcasting exactly which buttons they need to push. People do not disrespect you by accident. They do it because you have built a dynamic where disrespecting you yields a high emotional payout. Manipulators, narcissists, and those who play petty status games do not actually care about the insult itself. They care about the control the insult grants them over your nervous system. When you become emotionally unreachable, you starve them. By becoming completely immune to the fear of their rejection and utterly indifferent to the desire for their praise, you strip them of their only leverage. They realize, with a sudden and sinking dread, that they no longer possess the remote control to your mind. Detachment is not about being numb, depressed, or acting out some cartoonish villain fantasy. It is a highly active, lethal state of observation. It is the conscious, unbreakable decision that no external force gets to dictate your internal weather without your explicit permission. You observe their tactics the way a scientist observes a rat in a maze, curious, perhaps a little amused, but entirely unaffected by the rat's frantic movements. You must reach a point where a compliment does not make you levitate and a sudden insult does not make you crash. Only when you destroy your own desperate need for external validation can you forge an aura that no one else can shatter. Do not demand respect. Engineer a reality where disrespect is simply too expensive. When someone realizes that attempting to insult you only results in them looking foolish, petty, and desperate while you remain completely untroubled, the social cost of attacking you becomes too high. They will quietly pack up their games and move on to an easier target. This level of unreachability terrifies people who rely on emotional manipulation. They thrive in chaos, and your dead-eyed calm is a mirror reflecting their own lack of control. As you detach, you will watch them escalate. They will try harder to provoke you, throwing more pointed barbs, or they will attempt to guilt-trip you, calling you cold, arrogant, or distant. This is the death throes of their influence. Do not mistake their panic for your failure. It is the absolute proof that your new architecture is working perfectly. But be warned, when manipulators realize they can no longer control your emotions, they will panic and begin to aggressively test your physical and social boundaries. And this is exactly where most people fracture. When manipulators realize they can no longer control your emotions, they will panic and begin to aggressively test your physical and social boundaries. This is exactly where the facade of most people fractures, but it is precisely where you must learn to weaponize friction. Picture the moment a colleague tries to dump their late Friday workload onto your desk, disguised as a quick, harmless favor. Or think of a friend who constantly assumes you will drop your own plans to accommodate their last-minute chaos. The old version of you would have felt a sudden spike of resentment, but ultimately surrendered. You would have offered a long, anxious, and deeply apologetic excuse, softening the blow, over-explaining why you wish you could help before giving in anyway. Now, operating under these new laws, you do something fundamentally different. You look at them, entirely unbothered, and deliver a flat, absolute refusal. You say, "No, I won't be able to take that on." And then you close your mouth. You do not explain. You do not apologize. You simply let the harsh, uncompromising reality of your denial sit heavily in the space between you. Most people completely misunderstand what a boundary actually is. They think boundaries are angry declarations, dramatic confrontations, or emotional ultimatums delivered in the heat of a shouting match. But if you are shouting, you have already lost the frame. True boundaries are not loud. They are quiet, immovable friction. The Machiavellian mind understands that human beings naturally exploit what is easy and instinctively respect what is difficult to conquer. Value is inexorably tied to scarcity. When you make your time, your energy, and your agreement difficult to obtain, you do not push people away. Instead, you trigger a primal, subconscious, psychological mechanism in their brains. You force them to recognize your high status. Rather than seeing you as a convenient, bottomless resource to be used, they suddenly view your compliance as a prize to be won. This introduces the concept of the illusion of access. Right now, you are far too accessible. You reply to messages instantly. You say yes to invitations you secretly despise. You agree with opinions you fundamentally oppose, all because you want to avoid the friction of a disagreement. But friction is the very texture of power. Smooth surfaces offer no grip. People slide right past them without a second thought. When you introduce friction into your relationships, when you become selectively unavailable, when your agreement is rare and your refusal is absolute, you create a psychological grip. You teach people that your presence is a luxury, not a basic commodity. They learn that crossing your lines does not result in a dramatic argument they can win, but in the immediate, cold withdrawal of your attention. It takes a profound level of internal discipline to maintain this posture. People will inevitably test the handle of the door you just closed in their face. They will rattle it to see if you are bluffing. They might act deeply offended, feign hurt, or attempt to publicly label you as selfish and uncooperative. Let them. Their discomfort with your new boundaries is not your responsibility. A strategist does not break their frame simply because a manipulator is throwing a social tantrum. Every time you hold that line without an ounce of guilt, your aura solidifies into something tangible. You transition in their minds from an easy, predictable target to an immovable object. The air around you becomes heavy with the unspoken understanding that you are governed entirely by your own rules, completely immune to their expectations, and fiercely self-contained. You have stopped the bleeding. You are silent, detached, and heavily guarded. Now, we shift from defense to gravity, how to make them move entirely to your rhythm. You have stopped the bleeding. You are silent, detached, and heavily guarded. Now we shift from defense to gravity, how to make them move entirely to your rhythm. Picture a typical social gathering, a crowded group dinner, or a high-stakes networking event. There is almost always that one person dominating the center of the room. They are talking a little too loudly, throwing out rehearsed jokes, and constantly scanning the faces around them to measure the reaction. They are desperate for the group's validation, feeding off the laughter, the nods, and the agreeable smiles of the crowd. Most people instinctively play along. They hand over their social energy like obedient audience members because it feels polite. You, however, position yourself entirely differently. You sit back, perfectly relaxed, playing the role of the quiet observer. When they deliver their punchline, you do not laugh. When they look to you for that reassuring, compliant nod, you offer only a neutral, unreadable gaze. Watch very closely how quickly their confident facade begins to fracture. Without even realizing it, they will start directing their entire performance toward you. They will change their tone, alter their posture, and try subconsciously to win the approval of the one person in the room who refuses to freely give it. This is the lethal execution of asymmetrical leverage. When most people hear the word leverage, they picture cinematic blackmail or ruthless corporate threats. But in the reality of human nature, true leverage is far more subtle, invisible, and vastly more common. It is the ability to identify a person's deepest psychological dependency and subtly control the supply of it. Every single person you interact with is starving for something. Some are desperate for praise, others for inclusion, some for intellectual authority, and others simply for the relief of not being challenged. Your job as a Machiavellian strategist is not to judge these hungers, nor is it to blindly feed them. Your job is to map them. Once you figure out what someone is secretly begging the world to give them, you quietly position yourself as the gatekeeper to that exact resource. You stop being a participant in their emotional ecosystem and become the architect of it. If you have a manager who is deeply insecure about their authority and constantly demands deference, you do not fight them directly. You strategically ration your respect, making them chase your validation. If you are dealing with an arrogant peer who constantly needs to feel like the smartest person in the room, you withhold your awe, forcing them to work twice as hard to impress you. You are no longer engaging in a standard back-and-forth conversation. You are operating a valve. By doling out validation in microscopic, unpredictable increments, you create an intense psychological grip. Human behavioral studies on intermittent reinforcement prove this flawlessly. A person will obsess over a reward that is given inconsistently far more than one that is guaranteed. To execute this, you must overcome the deeply ingrained societal urge to be nice. Politeness, when used as a default reflex, is the death of power. Manipulators and social climbers rely on your politeness to extract what they want from you. When you stop giving away your reactions for free, you suddenly turn your attention into a high-value currency. People will begin to adjust their behavior, soften their demands, and alter their opinions just to earn a momentary flicker of your approval. They will not even realize they are doing it. They will simply feel an undeniable magnetic pull toward you, a desperate need to balance the scales that you have intentionally tipped. When you control the supply of validation, you control the entire dynamic. But there is one final piece to this architecture, the psychological seal that makes your new aura permanent. When you control the supply of validation, you control the entire dynamic. But there is one final piece to this architecture, the psychological seal that makes your new aura permanent. Think back to that humiliating moment we discussed at the very beginning, the crowded conference room or the loud group dinner where you were cut off and spoken over. Picture yourself back in that exact same chair, but this time you're operating under the new laws of power. When the inevitable interruption comes, you do not speed up your words. You do not raise the pitch of your voice to fight for your territory. Instead, you instantly stop speaking. You lean back in your chair, letting your body relax completely, and you fix your gaze on the person who interrupted you. You do not look angry. You look clinically observant. You let them rush through their point, letting them drown in their own desperate noise. When they finish, you do not immediately jump back in. You let a heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the table. You move slower. You speak only when the room has fully quieted to listen. And as you sit there, something remarkable happens. The frantic energy of the room begins to contour around you. They naturally lower their voices to match your calm. They hesitate before speaking out of turn. They bend entirely to your rhythm. This is the crown of the Machiavellian social strategist, the aura of inevitability. True power is not a theatrical act you put on only when you feel threatened. It is the brutal, unyielding consistency of these behaviors. The people who command rooms without saying a single word do not possess a mystical energy. They possess mathematical certainty. They project a total, undeniable guarantee that they will never, under any circumstances, bend to someone else's frantic frame. They are the immovable object in a world full of people desperately trying to force their way forward. When you combine the void of silence, the fortress of detachment, the friction of strict boundaries, and the asymmetrical leverage of withheld validation, you stop being a mere participant in the social hierarchy. You become the environment itself. Untouchability is not the absence of attacks. It is the absolute irrelevance of those attacks. When a manipulator realizes that their provocations yield no emotional response, that their demands are met with cold friction, and that their need for validation rests entirely in your hands, their brain is forced to categorize you as a superior force. You have rewritten their internal code. The world is loud, desperate, and endlessly hungry for attention. The vast majority of people will spend their entire lives begging for scraps of status, trying to outshout the noise, fundamentally misunderstanding the rules of the game. you are no longer one of them. Do not demand respect. Engineer a reality where disrespect is simply too expensive. When your boundaries are impenetrable and your silence is weaponized, any attempt to belittle or manipulate you simply costs the attacker too much social capital. They end up looking foolish, petty, and desperate, while you look entirely inevitable. This transformation begins the moment you step out of your front door tomorrow morning. As you walk into your office, your university, or your next social encounter, feel the physical weight of this new architecture. Drop your shoulders, slow your walking pace by 10%. When someone speaks to you, take a full second to breathe before you offer a reply. Strip the desperate, agreeable inflection from your voice. Let the anxious masses rush, panic, and over-explain themselves. You will remain quiet, controlled, and lethal. You will not try to convince them of your power. You will simply let them crash against it until they recognize it for themselves. The game has changed forever. You are the architect now, and silence is your weapon.